need to tell you something that happened to me 3 years ago, and I still get chills thinking about it. I mean, literal chills running down my spine. If it wasn't for a creature that most people think is just a myth, some made-up story to scare kids around campfires, my baby daughter would be dead right now. I'm not kidding around here. This really happened. Look, I know how this sounds. Trust me, I get it. If someone told me this story 3 years ago, I would have smiled politely and changed the subject. But I'm telling you the truth, and after you hear everything, maybe you'll understand why I can't just keep this to myself anymore. I've been hiking these mountains for over 15 years. I live in Colorado, right up against the Rockies, and I know these trails like the back of my hand. I'm not some weekend warrior who gets lost on marked paths. I've done overnight backpacking trips, winter camping, technical climbs. I know what I'm doing out there, or at least I thought I did. My wife was visiting her sister back east for a week, and I had some time off work. Our daughter was 18 months old then, just started walking, getting into everything. She loved being outside and would get so excited when she saw trees and birds. I had this hiking carrier backpack, real nice one, and she loved riding in it, so I figured, why not take her on an easy trail, something we could both enjoy? I picked this trail I'd done maybe 50 times before. It's popular with families, nothing challenging about it. About 2 miles up to a scenic overlook where you can see for miles across the valley. The trail is well marked, maintained, and in early spring, it should have been completely safe. Should have been. The morning started perfect. I mean, absolutely perfect. Clear blue skies, not a cloud anywhere, temperature in the mid-50s, barely any wind. My daughter was giggling and pointing at everything from her carrier, every bird that flew by, every squirrel that ran across the trail, every interesting rock or tree. Other families were out hiking too, and everyone kept commenting on how cute she was, how happy she looked. I was feeling pretty proud, like I was this great dad introducing my kid to the outdoors. We made good time up the trail. She loved the bouncing motion of the hike, and I was taking tons of pictures, her little hands reaching out to touch branches as we passed, her face lighting up when she spotted a chipmunk. It was one of those perfect father-daughter moments that you want to remember forever. We reached the overlook around noon, and it was beautiful. You could see the whole valley spread out below, snow-capped peaks in the distance. I set up a little picnic, gave her some snacks, and she actually fell asleep in the carrier. Just passed out with her head tilted to one side, completely peaceful. Most of the other hikers started heading back down around then. It was still early afternoon, plenty of time to get back before dark. But I noticed this side trail I'd never explored before. There was a small wooden sign that said it looped back to the main trail in about half a mile. I'd always been curious about it, but never had the time to check it out. Here's where I made my mistake. I should have stuck to the plan, stayed on the main trail, headed home. But the weather was so nice, my daughter was sleeping peacefully, and I thought a short detour would be fine. Just a quick look at this side trail I'd wondered about for years. The side trail started out easy enough, but it got steep fast. Steeper and rockier than I expected. The trail markers weren't as clear either, just occasional blazes on trees that were hard to spot. My daughter woke up and started getting fussy. She'd been so happy all morning, but now she was cranky and squirming in the carrier. I started getting this uneasy feeling. The trail didn't look well maintained. There were fallen logs across the path, loose rocks, overgrown sections where I had to push through branches. This wasn't the nice, family-friendly loop the sign had suggested. I decided to turn around and head back to the main trail. But when I turned around, everything looked different. The trail behind me didn't look like the way we'd come. I couldn't see the junction where we'd left the main trail. Nothing looked familiar. I started walking back the way I thought we'd come, but I wasn't sure anymore. That's when the weather changed. And I mean changed fast, like someone flipped a switch. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in maybe 5 minutes. dark clouds came rolling in from nowhere, completely blocking out the sun. The wind picked up and started howling through the trees. My daughter was crying now, really upset. She could sense something was wrong. I was trying to calm her down while figuring out where the hell we were. The trail markers had pretty much disappeared, and with the clouds blocking the sun, I couldn't tell which direction was which. Then it started snowing. Not light flurries, but heavy, wet flakes that stuck to everything immediately. The visibility dropped to maybe 10 feet ahead of us. I couldn't see the trail anymore, couldn't see anything but white snow and dark tree trunks disappearing into the storm. I was starting to panic. This was exactly the kind of situation that gets people killed in the mountains. Sudden weather changes, poor visibility, unfamiliar terrain. I had some basic supplies with me, but nothing for an overnight emergency. And I had my baby daughter to think about. I tried to retrace our steps, but the snow was covering any tracks we might have made. Everything looked the same. Trees, rocks, more trees. I kept walking, hoping to find something familiar, some landmark that would tell me where we were. The wind was getting worse, howling through the trees like something alive and angry. My daughter was crying harder now, that desperate sound babies make when they're really scared or uncomfortable. I kept trying to shield her from the wind and snow, adjusting the carrier to protect her better, but the weather was too intense. That's when I heard the rumbling. It started low, like distant thunder, but it kept getting louder. At first, I thought it might be a helicopter or search plane, but the sound was wrong. Too deep, too continuous. It was coming from above us, somewhere up the mountainside. I looked up through the swirling snow and saw something that made my blood turn to ice. A wall of snow and debris was rushing down the mountainside above us, maybe 200 yards away, but closing fast. An avalanche. The sound was incredible, like the mountain itself was coming apart. Trees were snapping like matchsticks, boulders bouncing and tumbling with the snow. It was moving faster than anything I'd ever seen, a white wall of destruction heading straight for us. I grabbed my daughter out of the carrier as fast as I could, fumbling with the straps with numb fingers. She was screaming now, terrified by the noise and my panic. I held her against my chest with both arms, trying to shield her with my body, and started running. But there was nowhere to go. The slope was too steep behind us, and the avalanche was covering too wide an area. I could see trees getting swallowed up on both sides of us. We were right in the path of the main flow. I made a split-second decision. There was a large boulder maybe 30 feet to our left. If I could get behind it, maybe it would deflect some of the snow. I ran toward it, slipping and stumbling in the deepening snow, holding my daughter as tight as I could. I almost made it. The edge of the avalanche hit us about 10 feet from the boulder. It wasn't the full force of the slide, but it was enough. The impact knocked me completely off my feet. I was rolling, tumbling, trying desperately to keep hold of my daughter while tons of snow and debris carried us down the mountainside. I managed to keep her pressed against my chest, using my back and shoulders to absorb the impacts as we bounced off rocks and trees. I could feel branches tearing at my jacket, rocks slamming into my spine. My ribs felt like they were being crushed, but I didn't let go of her. I couldn't let go. We tumbled for what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 or 40 seconds. When we finally stopped, everything went completely silent, except for the ringing in my ears. The world had gone white and still. I was buried up to my chest, packed in snow so tight I could barely move. My daughter was still in my arms, but she wasn't crying anymore. She wasn't making any sound at all. For a moment, I thought she was dead, that I'd failed to protect her, that I'd killed my own child by making stupid decisions. The terror that went through me in that moment was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It was pure animal panic, the kind that makes you want to claw your way out of your own skin. But then I felt her moving slightly against my chest, heard a small whimper. She was alive, but barely conscious. I could see blood on her forehead where something had hit her during the tumble. Her little hat was gone, her jacket was torn, and she felt cold, so cold. I started struggling to get out of the snow, using my arms to pull us both free. The snow was heavy and wet like concrete, but adrenaline gave me strength I didn't know I had. I managed to work my way out, still holding her, and got to my feet. The landscape around us was completely changed. What had been a forest trail was now a debris field of broken trees, rocks, and snow. The carrier backpack was nowhere to be seen. All our supplies, the extra clothes, the food, the emergency gear, all of it was gone, buried somewhere under tons of snow. My daughter was stirring more now, starting to cry again, but it was a weak sound that scared me more than her earlier screaming. She was going into shock from the cold and the trauma. Her lips were turning blue, and I could see she was having trouble staying awake. I had to find shelter, had to get her warm, but there was nothing around us except snow and broken trees. The storm was still raging, and the temperature was dropping fast. We were both soaked through from the snow, and hypothermia was setting in. That's when I noticed the tracks. At first I thought I was seeing things. The snow was still falling heavily, but there in the avalanche debris leading away from where we'd been buried were footprints. Huge footprints, bigger than any human could make. Each print was at least 18 inches long, maybe more, and shaped like a human foot, but wider, with clear toe impressions. They were deep too, like whatever made them weighed a lot more than a person. The stride length was enormous, maybe 4 or 5 feet between steps. I stared at those tracks for a long moment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Bear tracks looked different, more like paws with claw marks. These looked almost human, but the size was impossible. No person had feet that big, and no person could take steps that long. But they were the only tracks in the snow, the only sign that anything else had been through this area recently. And they were leading away from the avalanche, deeper into the forest where there might be shelter. My daughter was getting worse. Her crying had stopped completely, and she was just lying limp in my arms. Her skin was pale and cold, and her breathing was shallow. I knew she didn't have much time before hypothermia killed her. I started following the tracks. They were easy to follow at first, clear impressions in the fresh snow. But whoever or whatever made them was moving fast, taking those giant strides through terrain that was almost impossible for me to navigate. I was struggling through snow up to my knees, stumbling over hidden rocks and fallen branches, while these tracks just cut straight through everything. Following those tracks became an obsession. They were my only hope, the only clue I had to finding help or shelter. My daughter was unconscious now, her little body limp and cold in my arms. I kept checking for her breath, feeling for her pulse, terrified that each time I looked she'd be gone. The storm was getting worse. The wind was howling so loud I couldn't hear my own thoughts, and the snow was coming down so thick I could barely see the next set of tracks ahead of me. My hands were going numb, making it harder to hold on to her. My feet were numb too, and I kept stumbling and falling. Every time I fell, I was terrified I'd drop her or hurt her worse. I'd land on my knees or my side, always trying to keep her protected, but each fall made me weaker. I was losing feeling in my legs, and I knew I was getting hypothermia too. But I couldn't stop. The image of my wife coming home to find out I'd lost our daughter, that I'd made stupid decisions and gotten her killed, kept me moving. I couldn't live with that. I couldn't face that phone call, couldn't imagine the look in her eyes when she found out what I'd done. So I kept following those impossible tracks, even as they led me deeper and deeper into unknown territory. The trees got thicker, older, more primeval looking. These weren't the managed forest areas near the popular trails. This was wilderness, real wilderness, where people didn't go and things could live undisturbed. The tracks were getting harder to follow as the trees blocked more of the snow. Sometimes I'd lose them completely and have to search around in circles until I found them again. But they were always there, always leading deeper into the forest, always moving with that same impossible stride length. I started talking to my daughter even though she couldn't hear me, telling her we were going to be okay, that Daddy was going to find help, that we'd be home soon. My voice was getting hoarse from shouting over the wind, and I realized I'd been crying without knowing it. The tears were freezing on my face. The worst part was the silence from her. Babies cry when they're uncomfortable or scared or hurt. When they stop crying, when they go completely quiet and still, that's when you know something is really wrong. That's when you know you're running out of time. I lost track of how long I'd been following the tracks. Hours, definitely. The storm was so thick I couldn't tell if it was getting dark or if it was just the clouds blocking the sun. Time seemed to stretch and blur together. There was just the next step, the next track, the weight of my daughter in my arms getting heavier as I got weaker. Several times I thought about stopping, about trying to dig a snow shelter or find some protection from the storm. But I knew we wouldn't survive a night in the open. She was too small, too cold already. Our only chance was to keep moving, to find whatever had made these tracks. At some point, I started hallucinating from exhaustion and hypothermia. I thought I heard voices calling my name, thought I saw lights through the trees. But when I'd stumble toward them, there'd be nothing there except more snow and darkness. I fell down a small ravine and almost lost her. My foot caught on something hidden under the snow, and I pitched forward, tumbling down maybe 15 feet of steep slope. I managed to turn, so I landed on my back, keeping her on top of me. But the impact knocked the wind out of me, and I lay there for several minutes gasping. When I finally got up, I couldn't find the tracks. I searched frantically in the snow, but the ravine had confused me about directions. I didn't know which way I'd been going. Panic started to set in worse than before. Without the tracks, we were completely lost. Then I heard something that made my blood freeze, a sound like nothing I'd ever heard before. Deep, resonant, almost like a howl, but more controlled. It was coming from somewhere ahead of me, echoing through the trees. It sounded sad and lonely and ancient, like something that had been in these woods for a very long time, but it was also clearly not human. No person could make a sound that deep, that powerful. It seemed to come from something with a much larger chest cavity, bigger lungs. The sound carried through the storm like it was designed to travel long distances through the forest. I stood there in the snow, holding my dying daughter, listening to that impossible sound, and I had to make a choice. I could try to go away from it, try to find some other path to safety, or I could go toward it, toward whatever was making that sound. The tracks had been leading in that direction, and whatever was making that sound was alive, was breathing, was surviving in the storm. Maybe it knew where there was shelter. So I started walking toward the sound. As I got deeper into the woods, following that haunting call, I started noticing other things that didn't make sense. The trees here were different, older and bigger than anything I'd seen on the maintained trails. Some of them had to be hundreds of years old, massive trunks that would take 4 or 5 people holding hands to get around. But it wasn't just their age that was strange. Many of them had bark stripped off at heights that seemed impossible. 7, 8, 9 feet up the trunk, long strips of bark had been peeled away, like something tall had grabbed onto them. The exposed wood underneath looked fresh, like it had happened recently. Branches were broken too, thick ones that would take serious strength to snap. They were hanging down from heights that no human could reach, twisted and bent in ways that looked deliberate rather than random. Like something had pushed through the forest without caring about what was in its way. The smell hit me next. It was musky and wild, like wet dog mixed with something else I couldn't identify. Something earthy and primal, like the smell of caves or deep forest places where the sun never reaches. It was getting stronger as I moved forward, following that deep calling sound. I found what looked like a trail, but not one made by humans. It was wider than any hiking trail, with vegetation pushed aside rather than cut. Branches were bent and broken at shoulder height, but the shoulder height of something much taller than me. The path wound between the largest trees, taking the easiest route through the forest, like whoever made it knew these woods intimately. My daughter was so still in my arms, I kept checking to make sure she was still breathing. Her breath was just a barely visible whisper in the cold air. Her skin was waxy and pale, and her little fingers were turning blue despite being tucked inside my jacket. I knew I was losing her. The calling sound came again, closer this time. It was answered by another call from a different direction, then another. There was more than one of whatever was making these sounds. They were communicating with each other, calling back and forth through the storm like they were coordinating something. That should have scared me more than it did. But I was beyond rational fear at that point. I was desperate, focused only on saving my daughter. If these things, whatever they were, knew how to survive in this weather, maybe they could help her. I came across a stream that should have been frozen solid, but the water was still running. The banks were torn up like something large had been drinking there recently. There were more of those massive footprints in the mud, clearer now that they weren't filled with snow. I could see the individual toe impressions, the arch, the heel. They looked almost human, but wrong somehow, too wide and too long. The trees around the stream were marked too, deep gouges in the bark that looked like claw marks, but bigger than any bear could make. They were at head height for me, which meant whatever made them was taller than I was, much taller. Following the stream, I found more evidence of whatever lived in these woods. A tree that had been uprooted and moved not by wind or natural causes, but deliberately. It was lying across the stream like a bridge, positioned perfectly for something to cross without getting wet. No natural process could have placed it so precisely. There were structures too, if you could call them that. Lean-tos made of branches and pine boughs, crude but effective shelters tucked back among the larger trees. They were big, sized for something much larger than a human, and they looked lived in, used regularly. The largest shelter was made from several fallen logs positioned against a huge boulder. Pine boughs had been woven between the logs to create walls, and more boughs covered the ground inside like a bed. It was primitive but sophisticated, showing intelligence and planning. The smell was strongest around these shelters, that musky, wild odor that seemed to cling to everything. It was in the pine boughs, on the logs, soaked into the very ground. Whatever lived here had been here for a long time. That's when I heard footsteps, not the sound of boots on snow, but something else. Soft thuds like bare feet, but much heavier. The steps were spaced far apart, confirming the giant stride I'd been following in the tracks. Something big was moving through the forest nearby. I froze, holding my daughter tight, trying to decide whether to hide or call out. The footsteps stopped too, like whatever was making them knew I was there. We were both listening to each other in the silence of the storm. Then I heard breathing. Deep, measured breaths from somewhere very close but invisible in the thick snowfall. Whatever was out there was big enough that I could hear it breathing from 20 or 30 feet away. The breathing moved around me in a circle, always staying just out of sight behind the trees. It was checking me out, studying me, deciding what to do. I could feel eyes on me even though I couldn't see anything. My daughter made a small sound, just a tiny whimper, but it was the first sound she'd made in hours. The breathing stopped immediately. Whatever was out there had heard her. Then came that deep calling sound again, but this time it was right next to me. so close I could feel it vibrating in my chest. It wasn't aggressive or threatening. If anything, it sounded concerned, questioning, like it was asking what was wrong. That's when I saw the glow of firelight through the trees ahead. The light was orange and flickering, definitely a real fire, not some hallucination brought on by hypothermia. It was coming from a clearing maybe 50 yards away, just visible through the falling snow and the thick tree trunks. I started moving toward it, no longer caring about stealth or caution. My daughter needed warmth more than she needed anything else, and fire meant warmth. The footsteps followed me, staying parallel but out of sight, like whatever was making them was escorting me toward the light. As I got closer, I could see the clearing more clearly. It was a natural opening in the forest, surrounded by the largest trees I'd ever seen. In the center was a fire, not huge but well-maintained, burning steadily despite the snow. Someone or something knew how to tend a fire in these conditions. But what I saw next to the fire made me stop dead in my tracks. There was a figure sitting beside the flames, and it was massive. Even sitting down, it was taller than I was standing up. Its shoulders were broader than any human's, and its arms were like tree trunks. The entire figure was covered in dark fur, thick and shaggy like a winter coat. And cradled in those enormous arms was a small bundle that I recognized immediately. It was my daughter. The creature was holding her carefully, gently, like she was made of glass. She was wrapped in what looked like moss and soft pine needles. And for the first time in hours, she wasn't shivering. The creature was feeding her something from its finger, some kind of paste or pulp, and she was actually eating it. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My mind was trying to process what I was seeing, but it was too far outside the realm of possibility. This thing shouldn't exist. It was like something out of folklore, out of legends and campfire stories. But there it was, real as anything, holding my daughter and keeping her alive. The creature hadn't noticed me yet. It was completely focused on my daughter, making soft, grunting sounds that were almost musical. She was responding to it, making little baby sounds back, actually interacting with this impossible being. She wasn't afraid at all. I could see her more clearly now in the firelight. Her color was better, not the deathly pale she'd been when I was carrying her. The bleeding on her forehead had stopped, and she looked warm and comfortable, wrapped in that strange bedding of moss and pine needles. The creature was being incredibly gentle with her. Its hands were enormous, fingers as thick as sausages, but it was touching her with the delicacy of a surgeon. When it offered her more of whatever it was feeding her, it waited patiently for her to open her mouth, never forcing anything. It was talking to her too, in its own way. Deep, rumbling sounds that were clearly some form of communication. Not random animal noises, but deliberate vocalizations with different tones and inflections. It was having a conversation with my 18-month-old daughter, and she was responding like she understood. The creature's face was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was covered in fur like the rest of its body, but the features underneath were almost human. The bone structure was similar to ours, but larger, more pronounced. The forehead was broader, the jaw more powerful, but the eyes were unmistakably intelligent and aware. And those eyes were kind. That was the thing that shocked me most. This creature that looked like it could tear me apart with its bare hands was looking at my daughter with something that could only be described as tenderness. It was caring for her, protecting her, keeping her alive when I had failed to do so. I must have made a sound, or maybe it just sensed my presence, because suddenly those intelligent eyes turned toward me. We looked at each other across the clearing, this impossible creature and me, with my daughter between us. I expected it to be startled, to become aggressive or defensive. Instead, it just studied me calmly, taking my measure. It showed no fear, no surprise at seeing me. It was like it had been expecting me to show up. My daughter saw me too and made one of her happy sounds, the first truly positive sound she'd made since the avalanche. She reached her little arms toward me, but didn't seem distressed when the creature didn't immediately hand her over. She was comfortable where she was. The creature looked from me to her and back again, clearly understanding the relationship. It made a soft sound, almost questioning, and I realized it was asking me to come closer. I stepped out into the clearing on shaking legs. Up close, the creature was even more massive than it had appeared from a distance. It had to be 8.5 feet tall, maybe 9 feet when standing. Its shoulders were easily twice as broad as mine, and its arms were longer than they should be, reaching almost to its knees even while sitting. But despite its size and power, it radiated a calm, peaceful energy. It wasn't threatening or aggressive. If anything, it seemed pleased to see me, like it had been waiting for me to arrive so it could return my daughter safely. It stood up slowly, still holding her, and I had to crane my neck to look at its face. Standing, it was like looking up at a living statue, a creature out of myth and legend that had somehow stepped into reality. The creature extended its arms toward me, offering my daughter back. She looked up at both of us, this massive furry being and her human father, and made a contented sound like this was all perfectly normal, like being cared for by an 8-foot-tall forest creature was just another part of her day. I took her carefully, and she was warm. Not just warm from the fire, but deeply, thoroughly warm, like she'd been somewhere safe and protected for hours. The makeshift wrapping of moss and pine needles fell away, and I could see that her clothes had been dried somehow. They weren't the wet, freezing garments she'd been wearing when I lost her. She looked up at me and smiled, actually smiled, like she was happy to see me but had never really been worried. She babbled something in her baby language and pointed back at the creature, like she was trying to tell me about her new friend. What struck me most about my daughter's behavior was how completely comfortable she was with the creature. She showed no fear at all, no wariness that you might expect from a baby encountering something so far outside her normal experience. If anything, she seemed delighted by it. When the creature knelt down to be closer to her level, she reached out and grabbed a handful of its fur, the way babies do with everything they find interesting. The creature held perfectly still, letting her explore, making soft, encouraging sounds. She pulled herself up to standing in my arms and leaned toward the creature, trying to get closer to it. When it extended one massive finger, she wrapped her tiny hand around it and held on, chattering away in her baby language like she was telling it all about her adventure. The creature responded to her vocalizations with its own sounds, creating an impossible conversation between species. They seemed to understand each other on some level that I couldn't comprehend. It was like watching two friends who had known each other for years, not a human baby and a legendary forest creature meeting for the first time. When I tried to step back, putting more distance between us and the creature, my daughter fussed and reached back toward it. She didn't want to leave. She had formed some kind of bond with this being that had saved her life, and she was reluctant to say goodbye. The creature seemed to understand her reluctance too. It made soothing sounds and gently patted her head with one enormous finger. Then it did something that nearly made me cry. It kissed her forehead, a gentle touch of its lips against her skin, like a blessing or a promise to remember her. My daughter giggled at this, that pure baby laugh that means absolute joy. She patted the creature's face with her little hand, and it closed its eyes like it was savoring the moment. There was something deeply moving about the interaction, something that transcended the impossible nature of what was happening. The creature stood up and walked over to the fire, picking up something I hadn't noticed before. It was a small bundle, about the size of my fist, wrapped in what looked like large leaves. It brought it back and offered it to me, making gestures that seemed to indicate I should take it. Inside the leaf wrapping was more of the paste it had been feeding my daughter, along with what looked like dried berries and some kind of root or tuber. The creature was giving me food for her, supplies for our journey home. It pointed toward the edge of the clearing in a direction that felt like it might lead back toward civilization. Then it looked at me with those intelligent eyes and nodded like it was saying it was time for us to go. But before we left, it had one more interaction with my daughter. It made a series of soft sounds different from the ones it had been making before, more melodic. My daughter listened intently, like she was memorizing the sounds. Then she tried to repeat them, her baby voice attempting to recreate the creature's song. The creature's face, as much as I could read expression on something so different from human features, showed what looked like joy. It had taught her something, some form of communication that was theirs alone. The creature turned and started walking toward the edge of the clearing, and I realized it wanted us to follow. It was going to lead us out of the forest, guide us back to safety. Moving through the woods with the creature was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It knew every tree, every rock, every safe path through the terrain. It moved with absolute confidence in the darkness, never hesitating, never seeming uncertain about direction. When we came to obstacles, fallen logs, steep inclines, areas where the snow was too deep, the creature would clear the way for us. It would lift aside branches that would have blocked our path, step down steep areas first to pack down the snow and make it safer for us to follow. My daughter fell asleep in my arms as we walked, but it wasn't the unconscious sleep of hypothermia anymore. This was natural, peaceful sleep. She was warm and fed and safe, and her body was finally able to rest and recover from the trauma of the day. Several times during our journey, the creature would stop and look back at us, checking to make sure we were keeping up. When I stumbled or seemed to be struggling, it would slow its pace or wait for us to catch up. It was being considerate, protective, making sure we made it safely. We walked for what felt like hours, but I had completely lost track of time. The storm was lessening, and occasionally I could see stars through breaks in the clouds. The temperature was still cold, but I wasn't getting hypothermic anymore. The creature's pace was keeping me warm, and my daughter was like a little furnace in my arms. Eventually, I started to see things that looked familiar, not specific landmarks, but the type of terrain and vegetation that meant we were getting closer to maintained trails and roads. The trees were smaller and younger, the undergrowth less dense. We were leaving the deep wilderness behind. The creature led us to the edge of a dirt service road that I didn't recognize, but that was clearly maintained by the Forest Service. There were tire tracks in the snow, and I could see distant lights down the road that meant civilization. When I turned to thank the creature, to try somehow to express my gratitude for what it had done, it was already melting back into the forest. I caught one last glimpse of those intelligent eyes reflecting the starlight. And then it was gone, like it had never been there at all. My daughter stirred in my arms and looked around sleepily. She made a questioning sound and looked back toward the forest, like she was wondering where her new friend had gone. But she wasn't distressed, just curious. I started walking down the road, carrying her, and it felt like the longest walk of my life. Every step was taking us further from something impossible and back into the normal world where creatures like that don't exist and stories like ours don't happen. When we finally reached the small town at the end of the road, I called my wife and the search and rescue teams that had been looking for us. I told them we'd gotten caught in the avalanche, but managed to find shelter and wait out the storm. I said we'd stayed warm by huddling together and that my daughter had slept through most of it. I didn't mention the creature. I knew they'd never believe me. The doctors at the hospital were amazed that my daughter hadn't suffered any injuries or frostbite despite being exposed to those conditions for hours. She was actually healthier than when we'd started the hike. No signs of trauma, no distress, nothing. It was like the whole experience hadn't bothered her at all. They ran every test they could think of, but she was perfect. Better than perfect, actually. Her color was good, her vital signs were strong, and she seemed unusually alert and happy for a child who had supposedly been through such an ordeal. The rescue teams were puzzled by some aspects of our story. They found the avalanche debris where we'd been caught, but they couldn't understand how we'd gotten so far from that location. The place where they found us was miles away, across terrain that should have been impossible to navigate in the storm with a baby. I stuck to my story. We'd found shelter, waited out the worst of the weather, and then made our way to the road when the storm cleared. They accepted it because they had to, because the alternative was admitting that something they couldn't explain had happened. A few weeks later, when the snow melted, I went back to the area where we'd been found. I hiked all over those woods looking for any sign of the shelter I'd seen, the tracks, the clearing where the fire had been. I found nothing, no trace of any of it. But my daughter remembers something. She's 4 now, and whenever we drive past the mountains, she always looks toward the forest and points excitedly. When we watch nature documentaries, especially anything about gorillas or apes, she gets this look of recognition on her face and makes excited sounds like she's trying to tell me something. Sometimes she'll make sounds that don't seem like normal baby babble, deeper vocalizations that remind me of the creature's voice. When she does this, she looks at me expectantly, like she's waiting for me to respond in kind, like she's trying to use a language that only she remembers. She's drawn to the outdoors in a way that seems beyond normal childhood curiosity. When we go camping or hiking on easier trails, she's always looking into the deep forest, always listening to sounds the rest of us can't hear. Sometimes she'll point to something in the trees and make excited sounds, but when I look, there's nothing there. I think about that night constantly, how gentle the creature was with my daughter, how it fed her and kept her warm and brought her back to me safely, how it led us out of the forest without asking for anything in return. Most people would have left us to freeze to death, but this thing that's supposed to be just a myth risked its own safety to save a human child. I've started researching stories about similar encounters, people who claim to have met creatures like this in the wilderness. There are more stories than you'd think, going back generations. Native American legends, settler accounts, modern-day sightings. Most are dismissed as hoaxes or hallucinations, but now I wonder how many might be real. The common thread in many of these stories is protection, especially of children. Accounts of lost kids being found safe after days in the wilderness, with stories about big, hairy men who helped them. Hikers who get lost and are mysteriously led back to safety. People who should have died from exposure but somehow survived. The authorities always explain these cases away. Hallucinations from hypothermia, false memories from trauma, lucky coincidences. But now I know better. Now I know there are things in these mountains that most people will never see. Things that watch over travelers and help when help is needed most. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night wondering if there are more of them out there. If this creature that saved my daughter was alone, or if there's a whole community of them living in those mountains, watching over lost hikers and keeping the forest safe. I still hike those mountains, but I'm different now, more careful, more respectful. I stick to marked trails, carry proper emergency gear, check the weather obsessively. And sometimes when I'm deep in the forest and it's very quiet, I listen for sounds that don't belong. Deep calling sounds in the distance, heavy footsteps on trails where no human should be walking. I've never seen the creature again, but I feel like it's still out there somewhere. Watching the trails, keeping an eye on families with small children, ready to help when things go wrong. My daughter's getting older, and I wonder if she'll remember more details as she grows up, if she'll be able to describe what happened during those hours when she was missing. Part of me hopes she will remember, and part of me hopes she won't. It's a heavy thing to carry around, knowing that something everyone thinks is impossible actually exists. knowing that there are mysteries in these mountains that will never be explained or understood. But I'm grateful. Whatever that creature was, wherever it came from, it gave me back my daughter when I thought I'd lost her forever. It could have ignored us, let us freeze to death in that avalanche debris. Instead, it took care of a helpless baby for hours, kept her warm and fed and safe until it could return her to her father. I don't know if I'll ever see it again, and I don't know if I want to. Some experiences are so far outside normal life that they change you permanently. You can't just go back to thinking the world works the way you always thought it did. You know, there are things out there that science can't explain, creatures that exist in the spaces between what we think we know about reality. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I think about that moment when the creature handed my daughter back to me. How careful it was, how gentle, how it looked into my eyes with something that seemed almost like compassion. Whatever it was, it understood that I was a father who had lost his child, and it did everything it could to fix that. That's why I'm telling you this story now, not because I need you to believe me, but because I need to get it out somehow. I've been carrying this around for 3 years, and it's a lot to hold on to alone. Maybe there are other people out there with similar stories, people who've encountered things they can't explain and don't know how to talk about. If you ever find yourself lost in the mountains, if the weather turns bad and you can't find your way back to safety, pay attention to sounds in the forest that don't quite make sense. Look for signs that something large has passed through the area. And if you see massive footprints in the snow leading away from danger, maybe consider following them. There are things in these mountains that want to help, even if we don't understand what they are or where they come from. Things that will risk their own safety to save strangers, especially children. Things that exist in the spaces between myth and reality, watching over all of us, whether we know it or not. My daughter is safe because something impossible decided to make itself real for just long enough to save her life. That's not the kind of thing you ever really get over. It changes your whole perspective on what's possible in this world, on what might be out there in the wild places we think we understand. I still get chills when I think about it. But they're not chills of fear anymore. They're chills of wonder, of gratitude, of knowing that the world is far stranger and more miraculous than any of us realize. And sometimes, just sometimes, that strangeness reaches out to help us when we need it most. For more interesting stories like this one, consider checking this out.